Wait, don't scroll away from this video. You've grown used to thinking that Hollywood's golden age was all endless rivers of champagne, diamonds given as gifts, and bundles of cash tossed around without a second thought. You believed that the great screen icons lived as lavishly as the characters they played. A shameless lie. Today, I'm tearing the masks off those adored by millions who, in reality, trembled over every single cent. 9 of them were so miserly their greed bordered on madness. They pocketed leftovers at banquets, made guests pay for phone calls, and wore the same underwear for years. But the final story on our list will freeze your imagination. An actress who became the very symbol of elegance turned out to be the ultimate penny pincher. She lived in a filthy hotel room, ate canned cat food, and after her death, a fortune was found under her bed, enough to buy a small island. Ready to learn the truth that smells of cold air and cheapness? But before we move on to our first star, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit like, and leave a comment. Enjoy the show. Paul Newman. You look at his photographs and see an icon. Those piercing blue eyes, the strong jawline, impeccable suits, and the aura of a man above all earthly vanity. Paul Newman was Hollywood's gold standard, a symbol of masculinity, and, as the world believed, one of its greatest philanthropists. But I'm here to strip away that glossy veneer and show you what official biographies preferred to keep quiet. Behind the facade of St. Paul stood a man whose greed was so petty and all-consuming that even hardened Hollywood deal-makers found it distasteful. Paul didn't just save money, he was obsessed with every penny. With 6-figure sums sitting in his bank accounts, he behaved as if starvation in a gutter awaited him tomorrow. The dirtiest secret of his film set routine was this: Paul never, hear me, never paid for food if there was a free buffet nearby. Colleagues from The Sting and Cool Hand Luke recalled with a shudder how, after filming wrapped and the crew was already coiling cables, the great Paul Newman would approach the catering tables. And he didn't just grab a bite, he pulled out paper napkins and began methodically packing away the leftovers, slice by slice, cheese gone dry at the edges, wilted fruit, even half-eaten rolls abandoned by someone else. He hauled these scraps back to his trailer, then home, just so he wouldn't spend a single cent on dinner. A millionaire living off the lighting crew's leftovers. That was the real face of the idol. But that was only the beginning. His stinginess was pathological. Newman wore the same shabby shirts and jeans for years. No, this wasn't some early form of mindful consumption, as hipsters like to call it today. It was pure, concentrated greed. He patched his clothes until they literally began to fall apart on camera. Costume designers begged him to update his wardrobe, offering clothes for free, but Newman clung to his old rags because buying something new caused him almost physical pain. His wife, Joanne Woodward, had to secretly throw away his torn socks because Paul was ready to darn them forever. The most outrageous incident, which became the stuff of Hollywood legend, happened during the production of a major film. His agent, the man who negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts for him, once received a furious phone call from Newman in the middle of the night. Do you think they were discussing a script? No. Newman spent 40 minutes screaming at the agent over a dry cleaning bill. Paul had discovered he'd been charged an extra $1.50 for washing a shirt he claimed he had barely worn. A man whose shooting day cost tens of thousands of dollars wasted hours of his own time and someone else's just to get back $1.50. That's not thrift, that's an illness.
You might ask, what about his famous charity work, Newman's own sauces whose profits went to helping children? And this is where the most cynical calculation lies. In the United States, charity is the best way to avoid taxes. Newman built a perfect machine. He donated money the government would have taken anyway, while crafting the image of a saint that allowed him to keep skimping on tips. Speaking of tips, waiters in Beverly Hills sank into despair when they saw Newman seated at their table. He could order the most expensive wine, eat the finest steak, and then leave 50 cents as a tip, or nothing at all, scrutinizing the bill for the tiniest mistake. He drove an old, rattling Volkswagen when his garage could have been filled with Ferraris. He counted calories not to stay fit, but to avoid paying for an extra portion at a restaurant. Paul Newman was a slave to his fear, the fear of poverty he carried with him from hard times. But that fear turned him into a miserly knight, hiding his millions under a pillow while the world applauded his modesty. He died leaving behind a colossal fortune, but those who had seen him slip unfinished cheese into the pocket of his threadbare jacket knew the truth. This blue-eyed god was nothing more than an ordinary skinflint for whom the jingle of coins in his pocket was sweeter than any standing ovation.
Mae West. If you thought Paul Newman was the ultimate benchmark of stinginess, brace yourself. What follows is the dissection of a woman who was not merely the sex symbol of the 1930s, but a true dragon in a skirt, fiercely guarding her golden hoards. Mae West, the queen of double entendres, the woman who on screen seemed to bathe in sables, feathers, and colossal diamonds. The world believed she lived large, burning through the fortunes of her countless admirers. The truth, however, was far stranger. Mae West was a pathological miser whose greed bordered on paranoia and turned her private life into a surreal psychological thriller. Mae West's greatest secret was her absolute, almost feral distrust of banks. She was a child of an era when financial systems collapsed overnight, and the trauma never left her. While other stars invested in stocks or real estate, Mae transformed her luxurious apartment in Ravenswood into a private branch of Fort Knox. She demanded that her fees be paid exclusively in cash, in thick bundles of crisp bills. After her death in 1980, those who went through her belongings were stunned. In closets, old shoeboxes, suitcases, and, most bizarrely, in special chests hidden directly beneath her bed, millions of dollars were discovered. She quite literally slept on a mountain of money accumulated over decades, yet lived in conditions that could scarcely be called even solidly middle class. In daily life, Mae West was nauseatingly tight-fisted. Her assistants and personal secretaries later described working for her as penal labor. She economized on everything. Despite her enormous income, she never, under any circumstances, paid for her staff in restaurants. Worse, she would raise a scene over an extra cup of coffee on the bill, forcing her driver or assistant to flush with embarrassment and dig coins from their pockets to cover their own share. Mae believed that the mere privilege of being near her was payment enough, and she had no intention of wasting a single extra cent on these mortals. Her apartment resembled a mausoleum of miserliness. Mae lived in mortal fear of electricity bills. Her home was perpetually shrouded in half-darkness. Visitors recalled that she unscrewed light bulbs in hallways and bathrooms, leaving only one dim lamp glowing where she herself was sitting. She received guests in twilight, claiming it set the mood, when in reality she trembled at every turn of the electric meter. This was a millionaire who saved on light so she could count her bundles of dollars beneath her bed. The peak of her stinginess, however, was her relationship with the studios. Mae West was the first actress clever enough to bill Paramount for toilet paper and toothpaste. Her logic was simple. If she was considered studio property for the duration of her contract, then her personal hygiene qualified as a production expense. She demanded reimbursement for every trivial item, right down to pet food and laundry services for her personal underwear.
If flowers or decorative fruit baskets remained on set, Mae personally supervised their loading into her car. She stripped the studio of anything not nailed down, turning her home into a warehouse of complimentary clutter. She wore her famous wigs until they began to smell of dust and cheap glue, because spending $500 on a new one struck her as unjustifiable extravagance. She haggled with jewelers over every facet of a diamond, despite being able to buy the entire shop outright. Mae West was enslaved by possession. Money was not a means of living for her. It was her only true love, one that would never betray her or grow old. She died as one of the wealthiest women in Hollywood history, yet her ending reads like the story of a lonely old woman in a dark room surrounded by chests of paper that never brought her happiness. She proved that it is possible to be the most desired woman on the planet and still remain spiritually impoverished, valuing the clink of a coin above human warmth.
Humphrey Bogart. You're used to seeing him as Rick Blaine from Casablanca, a cynical yet noble knight ready to sacrifice everything for love and a just cause. Humphrey Bogart became the embodiment of male honor and unshakable resolve. But if you had gone with him to a bar after filming, your myth of the tough guy would have crumbled the moment the check hit the table. In Hollywood, Bogey was known not only as a great actor, but as the most masterful freeloader the industry had ever seen. His greed wasn't quiet like Newman's. It was brazen, systematic, and unbearably irritating to everyone unlucky enough to be in his orbit. Bogart's signature trick was so primitive it almost inspired a twisted kind of admiration. A man who was the crown jewel of Warner Bros. And earned astronomical sums suffered from a peculiar condition. He was chronically forgetting his wallet. The moment a group of actors or colleagues headed to a restaurant or private club, Bogart would pat his pockets and announce with innocent surprise, "Left my wallet in another jacket again." The first 10 times, people believed him. By the 100th, everyone understood this wasn't forgetfulness, it was a strategy. In the end, everyone paid for Bogey, from lighting techs scraping by on pennies to young actors who worshipped him. He dragged a long tail of unpaid bills behind him, convinced that his mere presence at the table was a royal favor others were obligated to finance. His stinginess revealed itself in the most petty and shameful details. Bogart was a passionate sailor and owned the luxurious yacht Santana. One would think that on his own vessel he'd play the gracious host, but greed ruled there too. Friends he invited on board recalled that Humphrey never bought food or alcohol himself. He said it outright, "Bring everything with you, the yacht's bare." So the millionaire Bogart drank other people's whiskey and ate other people's snacks on his own yacht without spending a cent on hospitality. Worse still, he could erupt at the first mate over an extra gallon of fuel, demanding an accounting for every drop, as if he were on the brink of bankruptcy. Bogart turned his life into an endless campaign of squeezing money out of everyone around him. He could torment his agent for hours, insisting on renegotiating a contract over sums that amounted to pocket change for him. He lived in constant terror of being cheated out of a few cents, even as his bank accounts overflowed. On set, when expenses came up, he became a tyrant. He demanded the studio pay for everything: cigarettes, barber services, anything at all, even if it wasn't in the contract. He clawed every penny from producers, shielding himself behind the excuse of being an indispensable star. His house in the Hollywood Hills stood as a monument to his parsimony. Bogart refused to renovate for years until plaster literally began falling onto his guests' heads. He drove an old, battered car that looked more like a wreck than a vehicle fit for a Hollywood demigod. When his wife, Lauren Bacall, tried to buy something new for the house, he launched interrogations worthy of a police station. "Why do we need new curtains? The old ones are still hanging."
To him, spending money was a personal insult, an act of aggression against his capital. Bogart died, leaving behind a vast fortune he never allowed himself to spend on a life of dignity. He was a king on screen, but in reality, he was a small-minded trader who valued free drinks more than his own self-respect. His life proved that you can be an icon to millions and still be the kind of man who conveniently forgets his own wallet just to avoid paying for his own dinner.
Bette Davis. If Humphrey Bogart was the king of freeloading, then Bette Davis was a true dictator in a skirt, for whom every cent spent was a personal insult. A two-time Oscar winner, a woman whose eyes could pierce through all the fakery of Hollywood, she herself was a master of double play. On screen, she portrayed strong, commanding, independent women, but within the walls of her own home, she transformed into a paranoid miser, a latter-day hoarder whose greed shattered the lives of those closest to her and made the household staff shudder in terror at the sight of the electricity bill. Davis was an underground millionaire who controlled her family's finances with the cruelty of a prison warden. Her daughter, B.D. Hyman, later recalled that life with her mother felt like incarceration in a maximum security camp, where fear was the main currency and the gravest sin was wastefulness. Bette knew the price of every match in the house. She could erupt into hours-long hysterics if she discovered a light left on in an empty room. Her mansion existed in deathly silence and perpetual gloom. The actress believed light bulbs were devouring her fortune and forced everyone to sit in the dark, saving miserable cents on electricity bills, while her capital in the banks generated thousands of dollars every month. Her stinginess with food bordered on pathology. Despite being able to afford the best chefs in the world, Bette Davis personally inspected the refrigerator and pantry. She labeled food so servants would not dare eat an extra slice of bread or drink a glass of milk. Meals in her house were served strictly by the clock and in portions so meager that guests left hungry. Meanwhile, the so-called Queen of Hollywood felt no shame haggling in local shops over dented cans or slightly rotten vegetables, demanding a discount for a loyal customer. Watching a global star foam at the mouth over a 5-cent reduction was not a spectacle for the faint of heart. But her greed revealed itself most viciously in her treatment of her children. Bette believed that every penny spent on their needs was theft from her own pocket. She forced her daughters to rewrite letters on the backs of old receipts so as not to waste a clean sheet of paper. When the children asked for new school shoes to replace the ones riddled with holes, Bette subjected them to an interrogation. "Are you absolutely sure you can't glue them?" Millionaire Davis preferred to see her children dressed in rags as long as her bank account remained untouched. She dragged them through discount outlets and clearance sales, hiding her face behind enormous sunglasses so no one would recognize the great actress in this stingy old woman. Her treatment of servants was notoriously cruel. Bette paid her maids and gardeners next to nothing, justifying it by saying that living in a star's house is privilege enough. She deducted the cost of a broken plate from their wages, or docked pay for excessive time spent at lunch. At the same time, Davis never left tips in restaurants or hotels. She believed the world already owed her. If Warner Bros. Provided her with a limousine, she demanded that the driver pick her up outside working hours as well, using studio transport for personal errands, simply to avoid burning her own gasoline. Bette Davis did not hoard money for dreams or comfort. She hoarded it for power. Money was her only loyal ally, one that could never argue back. She died leaving behind millions that never brought her any warmth. She was greedy to her final breath, trying to take with her every coin she had so fanatically guarded from her own husband and children. She proved to the world that one can have the eyes of Bette Davis and still possess a heart that clenches in pain at the sight of a single dollar being spent.
Clark Gable.
You thought Clark Gable was the generous, reckless Rhett Butler, the kind of man who could toss the whole world at a woman's feet without blinking? Forget that screen illusion. In real life, the king of Hollywood was so obsessed with money that his thrift bordered on a severe case of gold fever. Gable didn't merely build wealth, he turned his entire existence into a relentless audit, where every cent was tracked and any unnecessary expense sent him into a fit of rage. His greed was systematic and often slid into pure absurdity. Despite earning one of the highest salaries in film history, Gable cultivated a habit that drove his colleagues mad. He never, let me stress this, never treated his co-stars or friends. Even after months of working side by side on the same film, Clark couldn't bring himself to buy so much as a bottle of cheap beer for the crew. Worse still, he was a virtuoso at vanishing when the check arrived. Co-stars from Gone with the Wind recalled that Gable possessed an almost supernatural instinct. The moment a waiter approached the table, the king would suddenly remember an urgent phone call or excuse himself to the restroom. In the end, extras and assistant directors, people earning a fraction of his salary, paid for his meals. But the true scale of his stinginess revealed itself at his famous ranch in Encino. Gable liked to play the role of a humble farmer, but in reality, he behaved like a prison warden. Every morning, with his own hands, he counted the eggs in the chicken coop. Why? To make sure the staff hadn't stolen a single egg for their breakfast. He forced his wife to keep an exhaustively detailed expense ledger, recording the cost of every pound of flour and every sack of sugar. If the numbers were off by even a few cents, a drama unfolded on the ranch that rivaled Shakespearean tragedy. Gable was obsessed with tax deductions. He dragged receipts for every trivial purchase to his accountants, from toothbrushes to packs of cigarettes, trying to prove they were business expenses necessary to maintain his public image. He demanded that MGM reimburse him even for the gasoline he used driving from his house to the studio lot. Watching a man who earned millions haggle over $5 in travel expenses was cynicism at its finest. His passion for freebies knew no limits. If anything was left over on set, props, clothing, or, heaven forbid, untouched baskets of delicacies used in a scene, Gable felt it was his duty to stuff them into the trunk of his car. He didn't hesitate to take home used towels from the makeup room. Gable sincerely believed the world owed him simply for being who he was. His greed was born from the fear of slipping back into the poverty he had once escaped while working on oil rigs, but that fear turned him into a slave to his own wallet. He died leaving behind a multi-million-dollar estate, yet those who knew him behind the scenes remembered him not as a great actor, but as a man capable of causing a scandal over a single missing egg. Clark Gable proved that you can wear Hollywood's crown and still possess the soul of a small-time shopkeeper, for whom the shine of a gold dollar was always brighter than the gleam of an Oscar.
Marlene Dietrich. Prepare yourself for the harshest revelation of all. You are accustomed to seeing Marlene Dietrich wrapped in clouds of swan's down, drowning in silks and diamonds, the untouchable blue angel, disdainful of everything mundane and earthly. But now the chiffon curtain is coming down. Behind the mask of a goddess hid a woman whose obsession with saving money reached the point of absurdity and, at times, a complete loss of human dignity. Marlene Dietrich was a millionaire who lived in terror of every unnecessary expense, turning her existence into an endless battle for loose change. Let us begin with the fact that the divine Marlene was Hollywood's finest laundress. Yes, you heard that correctly. Despite her colossal fees, Dietrich was pathologically afraid of sending her clothes to professional cleaners. She considered laundries daylight robbery.
In her luxurious hotel suites in Paris or New York, she would lock herself in the bathroom and spend hours washing her famous silk stockings, lingerie, and even stage costumes by hand. She dried them over chairbacks and lampshades, transforming five-star apartments into something resembling a communal flat. Why pay $1 to a laundress when you can spend 3 hours of your own time and save it? This was a woman worshipped by princes and presidents, scrubbing stains out of her dresses so her bank balance would not shrink by a single cent. Her greed was methodical and cold. Marlene kept meticulous expense notebooks, recording the cost of every loaf of bread, every liter of milk, every pack of cigarettes. If she spotted a 5-cent error on a restaurant bill, the waiter would suffer for it. Dietrich could stage a frigid, blood-chilling scene over a cup of coffee mistakenly added to her check. She stripped hotel rooms from everything not bolted to the floor: soap, shampoo, slippers, even toilet paper. Her suitcases were always stuffed with complimentary hotel amenities, hoarded over the years. Most shocking of all was her mania for saving electricity. Every time she left a home or hotel room, Marlene personally checked every outlet. She yanked plugs from the wall, convinced that even switched-off appliances were sucking her money. She received guests in half-darkness, economizing on light, and forced lovers and friends to sit in cold rooms because heating was too expensive. Millionaire Dietrich preferred to wrap herself in an old threadbare blanket rather than pay extra dollars to utility companies. Her so-called thrift bordered on pathology. Marlene was a master of altering old clothes. She could wear the same coat for decades, patching it and changing collars so the public would believe it was new. She bought groceries only in the cheapest shops and always demanded a discount for a loyal customer. At the same time, she was ruthlessly greedy when it came to other people's property. If an admirer gave her a piece of jewelry, she immediately took it to a jeweler to learn its real value and resell it if the item was not expensive enough. The final years of Dietrich's life in Paris were the apex of her miserliness. She shut herself inside her apartment on Avenue Montaigne and did not step outside for years. She lived in a filthy room, surrounded by antiques and mountains of old newspapers she refused to throw away, hoping one day to sell them profitably as scrap paper. She saved on food, ordering the cheapest items through her window, and on medicine, preferring to endure pain rather than pay a doctor's fee. She died alone, leaving behind millions, yet in her refrigerator they found only a dried piece of cheese and an empty bottle of cheap wine. Marlene Dietrich proved that one can create an image of perfection and still die in poverty of one's own making, born of fear of the world and of one's own greed.
Charlie Chaplin. Brace yourself. What you're about to hear is the story of a man whose screen image, a penniless tramp in torn shoes, turned out to be a cruel joke played on the entire world. Charlie Chaplin, the great comedian, the genius of silent cinema, and the first actor in history to sign a $1 million contract. Yet behind the bowler hat and the cane hid one of the most calculating and tight-fisted operators Hollywood had ever produced. His greed wasn't merely a personality trait, it was his philosophy, his religion, and his greatest curse. Marlon Brando, never one to mince words, called Chaplin the stingiest man I've ever met, and he had every reason to say so. Chaplin's signature move in social life was worthy of his finest comic routines. Despite a fortune measured in tens of millions, Charlie was terrified of parting with cash. He developed a system that drove friends and business partners to madness. Chaplin never, under any circumstances, carried a wallet.
When the time came to pay the bill at a luxury restaurant, Charlie would suddenly fall into a creative trance or launch into an enthusiastic monologue about a new film idea. If that failed, he'd theatrically pat his pockets and exclaim with feigned horror, "My God, I left my money in another jacket." In the end, everyone paid for him, from wealthy producers to struggling young actresses who barely had $1 to their name. He dragged behind him the reputation of a professional freeloader, convinced that the world owed free meals to a genius. But inside his own studio, Chaplin transformed from a forgetful friend into a true penny tyrant. He personally inspected bills for sets, nails, and even makeup. Colleagues told stories that bordered on the unbelievable. Chaplin would halt the filming of an expensive crowd scene if he noticed a worker using too much glue or throwing away scraps of wood. He forced carpenters to straighten old nails and reuse them rather than buy new ones. His parsimony reached grotesque levels. He demanded that actors return even worn-out socks issued as part of their costumes so they could later be handed down to extras in another film. His greed knew no limits when it came to personal relationships. When his first wife, Mildred Harris, filed for divorce, Chaplin declared open war over every dollar. In court, he tried to argue that she ate too much and spent outrageous sums on soap and cosmetics. The great on-screen humanist was ready to grind the mother of his child into the dirt just to avoid paying fair alimony. He believed that any woman in his life should be grateful for the honor of being near him, and he had no intention of paying for it. At home, Chaplin behaved like a miser straight out of a medieval fable. He kept a strict count of every bottle of wine in the cellar and personally handed servants money for groceries, only enough for the simplest possible meal. Guests at his mansion were served tiny portions, while Charlie himself might sip a single cup of tea all evening just to avoid opening an expensive bottle of champagne. He hauled office supplies home from the studio, paper, stationery, even used soap slivers, firmly believing that a penny saved was a penny earned. Charlie Chaplin died in Switzerland in a luxurious estate, a multi-millionaire to the end. But history remembers him not only as the little tramp, but as a man who carried the worst traits of his characters into real life. His fortune kept growing, while his soul shrank to the size of the very copper penny he was willing to fight over until his last breath. He proved that you can make the whole world laugh and still remain someone whose stinginess inspires nothing but a bitter smile.
Greta Garbo. Prepare yourself. We are about to peer through the keyhole of the life of Hollywood's most enigmatic woman, Greta Garbo. She was called the Swedish Sphinx, the goddess of solitude, the woman who wanted to be left alone. The world believed Garbo was an ethereal being, living in realms of poetry and silence. Yet behind that icy calm hid a nature so tight-fisted and calculating that it shocked even the most hardened Hollywood deal-makers. Garbo was not merely frugal, she was a professional miser who turned her New York life into an endless quest to preserve every single dollar. Possessing a fortune that today would be valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, Greta Garbo lived like a modest pensioner, scraping by on benefits. Her legendary walks through New York, so lovingly described by newspapers, had a painfully mundane explanation. Garbo despised taxis. She would walk 30 blocks in pouring rain or snow rather than pay $1 for a ride. A global star whose face was synonymous with luxury carried heavy grocery bags through the streets herself because delivery cost extra cents. She dressed in baggy, worn-out clothes from discount shops, hiding her face under an old hat not only from paparazzi but from shopkeepers as well, so they wouldn't dare raise prices upon recognizing a celebrity. Her New York apartment on 7th Avenue was a monument to glacial stinginess.
Despite her immense wealth, Greta refused for decades to renovate it. Wallpaper faded and peeled, plumbing leaked, and the furniture looked like it belonged in a cheap boarding house. Garbo genuinely failed to understand why anyone would spend money on comfort when it could be invested in stocks or left to accrue interest. She rarely received guests, and those few visits were remembered with a shudder. The goddess might offer a visitor a single cup of the cheapest tea without sugar or biscuits, all the while carefully watching that the guest did not linger too long. Electricity cost money. Her greed showed itself most starkly in matters of charity, or rather, in its complete absence. In Hollywood, Garbo was known as someone from whom it was impossible to extract even a cent for the noblest causes. When the Red Cross or Children's Relief Funds approached her, she replied in her famous icy tone, "I can barely live myself." This was said by a woman who earned enough per film to build a school. Her possessiveness was pure and absolute. She needed to know that her money lay untouched in a safe, cold, and inviolable, just like herself. After her death in 1990, the world reeled. It emerged that the poor recluse Garbo was in fact one of the richest women on the planet. Her estate was valued at over $30 million in cash and securities, and her art collection, containing original works of Renoir and Bonnard, was worth just as much again. Most chilling of all, Garbo never truly enjoyed these paintings. They hung in darkened rooms behind drawn curtains so light would not damage the paint, while her owner saved on heating, wrapping herself in an old blanket beside masterpieces of world art. She died without leaving a single cent to charity, bequeathing everything to her niece. Greta Garbo proved that one can be the most beautiful woman in the history of cinema and still live a life of poverty, poverty of one's own making, born of fear of the world. Her icy miserliness froze her soul long before her death, leaving behind only piles of gold and an emptiness where a heart should have been.
Joan Crawford. If you thought her daughter's memoir, Mommy Dearest, was nothing more than the resentment of an abandoned child, you're gravely mistaken. It is a survival chronicle from a financial concentration camp Joan Crawford built behind the glittering facade of her dazzling estate. An Oscar-winning diva, the face of Pepsi-Cola, and one of the most powerful women in Hollywood history, she was more than a perfectionist. She was a financial tyrant, for whom thrift was a form of sadism, and every spent cent a pretext for psychological execution. Crawford was an underground millionaire whose fortune grew exponentially while her household trembled with fear at the very thought of entering the bathroom. Her legendary obsession with cleanliness was merely a smokescreen for total, pathological control over resources. Joan, personally, stopwatch and ruler in hand, inspected the length of soap slivers. If she discovered that a bar had been thrown away before it was reduced to a transparent, nearly invisible film, the house went into full emergency mode. She could drag the children out of bed in the middle of the night and conduct hours-long interrogations, demanding a confession. Who had dared to throw money away? Millionaire Crawford believed that any uncontrolled expense was a crack in her armor, and she patched that armor with the nerves of those closest to her. Her stinginess with food bordered on madness. Despite holding shares in massive corporations, Joan turned feeding her adopted children into a rationing system. A regime of sterile hunger reigned in her home. She bought groceries only at a discount, and if untouched appetizers or expensive delicacies were left over at lavish parties hosted by wealthy friends, Crawford would calmly slip them into her Chanel handbag. The next morning, the Queen of Hollywood served these stale leftovers to her children, proudly savoring the fact that she'd saved a couple of dollars on breakfast. But her greed truly blossomed after she became the widow of Alfred Steele, the head of Pepsi.
Once she secured a seat on the board of directors, she turned the corporate giant into her personal feeding trough. Crawford billed the company for everything, from international flights to sewing thread and dog food. She even managed to write off personal cosmetic surgeries as a production necessity for maintaining the brand's image. Crawford was a genius at shifting expenses onto other shoulders. She believed the world owed it its support to a living legend, while her own bank accounts remained strictly untouchable. Her dressing room held gowns worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, yet in daily life she was the undisputed queen of hand-me-downs. She forced tailors to alter her old dresses over and over again, just to avoid buying new fabric. Her famous massive shoulder pads weren't just a fashion statement, they were a way to conceal the fact that the jacket beneath them was already splitting apart with age. She was greedy to her final breath. Even in her will, she struck one last blow. Joan completely disinherited her eldest children, Christopher and Christina, for reasons, as she wrote, well known to them. In truth, there was only one reason: her pathological inability to part with money even after death. She died surrounded by sterile silence and empty rooms, leaving behind millions that never brought her warmth, proving that one can own an empire and still remain a slave to a penny-sized sliver of soap.
Hedy Lamarr. And so we arrive at the final story, one that concentrates everything strange, painful, and shocking that human greed is capable of producing. Brace yourself. This ending truly is mind-blowing. Hedy Lamarr, the woman once hailed as the most beautiful in the world, a screen icon whose profile was considered the very standard of perfection. Yet few knew that behind this unearthly beauty lived one of the sharpest minds of the 20th century and one of Hollywood's most fractured souls. Hedy Lamarr was not merely an actress. She was the inventor of a communication system that later became the foundation of Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. But her brilliant mind ultimately turned against her, transforming her old age into a nightmarish carnival of miserliness and pathological hoarding. In the final decades of her life, Hedy Lamarr became a ghost of Florida. A woman who once commanded the admiration of millions and the fortunes of oil tycoons, voluntarily locked herself inside a tiny, cluttered apartment overflowing with junk. To neighbors and passers-by, she looked like nothing more than a local madwoman. She shuffled to the nearest supermarket in a filthy, threadbare robe, her face hidden behind oversized glasses, and she stole. Yes, you heard that correctly. The great Hedy Lamarr, whose inventions are worth billions today, was repeatedly caught shoplifting. She pocketed cheap lipstick, candy, worthless trinkets, even laxatives. The public was stunned. Newspapers screamed about the fall of an idol. Pitying fans sent her money. Neighbors left bags of food at her door, convinced the former screen goddess was dying of hunger and poverty. Hedy accepted this help, meekly playing the role of a forgotten, destitute old woman. But when she died in 2000, the lawyers who opened her accounts were struck dumb. This pauper was a multimillionaire. Her bank balances held sums large enough to buy an entire block in Miami. Her greed had reached the level of outright mental disorder. She lived in a filthy apartment where the plumbing had not worked for years because Hedy refused to pay a plumber. She survived on cheap canned food, convinced that spending money on fresh meals or restaurants was unjustifiable extravagance. She did not buy new clothes for years, endlessly patching old rags until they disintegrated into tatters. Hedy Lamarr was a prisoner of her own greed. She knew she was rich, but the instinct to hoard was stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. She owned millions, yet could not allow herself a new robe or a repaired faucet. She died in complete solitude, surrounded by piles of trash, old newspapers, and unopened bank statements confirming her immeasurable wealth. This was the most pathological, most absurd form of greed, possession without use. She wanted to own everything, but to share nothing, not with the world, not even with herself. Her name remains forever linked to technological progress, but her life stands as a dark reminder of how greed can turn a goddess into a beggar,
and a genius into a slave of her own hoard.
10 names, 10 legends whose faces are carved into the granite of world cinema history. We're used to looking up at them, seeing them as untouchable gods, far removed from our ordinary earthly troubles. But today, we've seen a different reality. Behind the blinding shine of Oscars, the luxury limousines and designer gowns, there was an underside that smelled of cold basements and stale, unwashed clothes. These people owned the world, yet couldn't bring themselves to buy an extra piece of bread or leave $1 for a waiter. Just think about the paradox. Paul Newman pocketing leftovers at banquets, Greta Garbo living among dusty ruins of her own apartment, surrounded by masterpieces worth tens of millions. This isn't thrift, it's a tragedy on a planetary scale. They turned their lives into endless accounting ledgers, where the profit column was overflowing while the happiness column gaped with a vast black hole. They were among the richest people on earth, yet in truth they were the most pitiful paupers the world had ever seen. Greed became their real director, dictating scripts with no room for love, generosity, or basic human dignity. They hoarded money as if they planned to bribe death itself or leave $1 for a waiter. And in the end, all that remained of their manic stinginess were dusty suitcases of cash hidden under beds and bitter court battles between heirs who spent years dividing every cent their great but endlessly greedy ancestors had saved. Hollywood is a vanity fair where every gram of fame is paid for with a piece of the soul, and our heroes today paid in full. They chose numbers on bank statements over human warmth, over the respect of colleagues, over peace in their own families. They proved that you can have the most piercing gaze in film history, like Hedy Lamarr, and still steal cheap candy from a store because your mind has long been poisoned by the venom of hoarding. So the next time you see Clark Gable's flawless smile on screen or Marlene Dietrich's icy elegance, remember this truth. Remember the filthy bathrobes, the darned socks, and the bags of money rotting away in closets. Money is a good servant, but a terrible master, and our heroes became slaves to that master until their final breath. Whose story shook you the most? Which of these idols disappointed you most when their true face was revealed? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about whether such fame is worth such a life. Don't forget to hit like if you also believe that humanity is worth more than any gold bar. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell because we're only just beginning to dig through the dirty laundry of the Golden Age. More shocking confessions and torn-off masks lie ahead. Stay with us. We tell the truth here, no matter how cheap it may seem at first glance.